There has been a lot of chatter and concern in the early days of this administration about having an unelected man with a vast personal fortune overseeing the fiscal matters of American federal agencies. Elon Musk has been, in many ways, unilaterally making decisions about costs, staffing, and expenditures. This is, to a wide swath of Americans, a concerning movement away from the checks and balances built into the three constitutional branches of our federal government, and instead, a turn toward an oligarchy that is non-representative at best. Regardless of one's opinions on current events taking place in Washington, D.C., it's worth noting that there is actually a parallel in American history. Whether the outcomes for the nation will be as positive now as they were during the Revolution is a question still to be answered. Today on When You Weren't Listening, Robert Morris, the sugar daddy of America. Welcome to the second episode of When You Weren't Listening, a podcast that aims to touch on topics that may or may not have come up in that history class you were sleeping, daydreaming, writing notes, or gaming on your phone through. I'm Amber Jansen, a high school history teacher, and I'm thrilled you want to spend part of your day in my online classroom. The most intelligent people I know never stop learning, so congratulations on choosing to become smarter today. Okay, so before we get to Robert Morris, I need to set the historical scene for you. During the American Revolution, our Congress was operating under the Articles of Confederation, our first governing document. Because so much of the angst behind the revolution was based on what colonists saw as an overreach of power by England, especially regarding the various taxes that had been levied by Parliament on Americans to pay off British debts, the decision was made that under the Articles of Confederation, federal taxes would not be collected. State governments at this time were seen as far more representational, so there was more comfort with them assessing taxes. The states were then asked to contribute to the federal treasury, but they rarely did so. This left the federal government reliant on the states to call up and pay soldiers during the American Revolution. This also left Congress and General George Washington with basically no control over what troops, if any, he would have to command. To say things were chaotic would be an understatement. It's onto this scene that Robert Morris enters, a very wealthy man who had a boatload of government connections. Morris had made his money in shipping, which turned into profiteering off illegal shipments to and from Europe once the war broke out. He had been elected to a few different positions in state and national organizations, including the Continental Congress, but by 1779, he was back to being a private citizen. His focus was on expanding his business, and he eventually partnered with some other wealthy men to form the Bank of Pennsylvania, which ended up being the example institution for many future financial decisions regarding U.S. banks, including having a paper currency backed by hard gold and silver from investors. It was this financial background that led Congress to appoint Robert Morris to the role of Superintendent of Finance in 1781. There had recently been a mutiny from 10 of the Continental Army regiments over their treatment, pay, and conditions, which forced Congress to enact some changes, such as Morris's new post. Morris had mixed results in his work as superintendent. He did convince Congress to establish the Bank of North America, which Morris planned to use to stabilize American currency, accept state deposits, such as they were, and help fund the war. But it needed startup money. It was at this point that Morris took two major steps. First, he used his own money to provide the backing for the currency being created. It ended up being called Morris Notes. He then committed to paying for all supplies for the entirety of the Continental Army for the remainder of the war, freeing state governments up to pay solely for funding their local soldiers. By the summer of 1781, the Revolutionary War was at an impasse. Morris met with General Washington and a French representative to put together financing between the Americans and the French to help the colonists finally and fully defeat the British. Morris raised $1.4 million of his own credit to help pay for this agreement, even as he continually petitioned Congress with different ideas to raise revenue for the effort via amendments to the Articles of Confederation. All of these efforts were rebuffed. After all this, Morris then had to supply over $800,000 in his own money to keep the Continental Army from walking off the job. These funds, plus Washington's efforts to quell any sort of rebellion from the troops during 1782, were the only things that kept the war effort afloat. By 1783, the war was unofficially over, and Morris's finances were in bad shape. If you convert the money he'd spent on the war to $25, it comes out to over $46 million. He left his government post in 1784 and ended up heading back into private business, not wanting to wade through what would become the Constitutional Convention and the initial formation of the U.S. government as we know it today. He spent over a decade investing in land deals and different business ventures until he fell in arrears on a number of payments and was unable to survive the financial panic of 1797. Morris ended up land rich but cash poor. In fact, he owned more land at this time than any other person in America. But he had to declare bankruptcy. He spent the next 3 years in debtor's prison, gaining release in 1801. And when he died in 1806, all he had left of value to leave to his son was a watch he had inherited from his father. It may seem astounding to us today that a man so wealthy and influential, a man who, it could be argued, allowed the United States to win the Revolutionary War, could die a pauper with no one from the nation he helped create stepping up to aid him. In a nation where we've come to worship wealth and fame, did we owe Robert Morris a better ending than he got? Or should his loss of many millions consign him to the historical dust heaps of the forgotten and the for granted? But perhaps more importantly, should any one man have so much sway over the outcomes of a nation simply because he can afford to buy its future? I'll let you be the judge of what money can and should be able to access, even if, in our case, that may have meant that we never had a nation at all. Thanks for joining me on this episode of When You Weren't Listening. Come back next time for information on America's new Gilded Age.